Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I would ask everyone here in-house to make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin our program. We, of course, will accept questions from the internet at any time or their comments, simply emailing us speaker@heritage.org. Our program will be posted then on the Heritage homepage following today's presentation also for your future reference. Opening our session this morning is Cully Stimson, who serves as manager of our National Security Law Program. He is also a senior legal fellow in our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He is a nationally recognized expert in crime control, national security, and homeland security. He writes and lectures widely on policy issues such as the war on drugs, immigration, military detention, and commissions, as well as in intelligence and criminal law. Before joining us at Heritage, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs. He has also worked as a prosecutor at the local, state, and federal levels, including military settings, and as a defense attorney. Please join me in welcoming Cully Stimson. Cully?
Thank you very much, John. And before I get started, I want to thank John and his staff in particular. A lot of work goes on behind the scenes before these events take place. And John very smoothly comes up here, gets you all quieted, asks the phones be turned off. But there's hours and hours of work that take place beforehand to handle the logistics. So I want to ask you to join me in thanking John and his staff for organizing these events. Well, welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Today's policy program is actually going to be in two parts. The first part we'll hear from our distinguished keynote speakers, starting with Dr. Harris and then Dr. Fleming. And then second, after I give them a small token of our appreciation, they'll go back to the Congress and do the people's work, and we'll bring our panel up. We'll get the stage a little reorganized, and then we'll start the second part, which will be our panel presentation. Sound public policy needs to be based on facts, not popular fiction. And facts are, as the saying goes, stubborn things. Yet in the ongoing national debate about marijuana legalization, the scientific facts have, quite frankly, been lost in a smoky haze of popular fiction and superficial bumper sticker feel-good blather. The purpose of today's event is to lay out the scientific facts about marijuana. Our panelists are some of the nation's top experts in their field. But before I get ahead of myself, let me introduce our two keynote speakers, each of whom, like me, served in the United States Navy. Congressman Andy Harris represents Maryland's 1st Congressional District, which for the most part is the eastern shore of Maryland. He was first elected to office in 2010. He spent over 3 decades practicing as an anesthesiologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, where he also served on the faculty where he trained future physicians. He's one of the only members of Congress to have ever performed NIH-funded research. And in the interest of full disclosure, I, like a lot of people, co-hosted several fundraisers for Andy when he first ran for office, and I was proud to do that. Dr. John Fleming was first elected to Congress in 2008, and he represents Louisiana's 4th Congressional District. He's been a family physician for nearly 40 years, and before that served as a medical officer in the United States Navy. He was Louisiana's Family Doctor of the Year in 2007, and has worked on addiction treatment throughout his medical career. He's the author of Preventing Addiction, What Parents Must Know to Immunize Their Kids Against Drug and Alcohol Addiction. So, Drs. Harris and Fleming, thank you very much for coming to Heritage and joining us. I know you're busy, especially this last week of the congressional calendar. And Dr. Harris, I'll turn the stage over to you.
Thank you very much, Cully, and I want to thank Heritage Sam and others for holding this discussion on marijuana legalization. You know, today I wear two hats. One is obviously as a legislator, as a congressman, but the other one, like Dr. Fleming, as a physician.
I don't want to listen to these lies, I'm sorry.
The issue is important because it's actually in the current context of the ability of an administration to pick and choose which federal laws they want to enforce. This is a timely discussion. Because, you know, the Controlled Substances Act is decades old. I know about it well because I'm licensed under it. I have to be licensed, as Dr. Fleming is, if we want to prescribe controlled substances, and we have to abide by it. But the discussion now is about whether various states are going to abide by it, whether individuals are going to have to abide by it who are non-physicians, and whether or not it's going to be a national, we're going to change national policy. Because the Controlled Substances Act, under it, marijuana is listed as Schedule I drug. Schedule I drugs have no proven medical purpose. And honestly, I think we're far from scientifically proving that marijuana has a medical purpose. Are we going to get there for some components? Yeah, I think we will, but we're far from it now. And a change to the scheduling of marijuana could be done by the DEA and the FDA jointly, or it could be done by Congress. Now, as a physician, why am I so interested in this? I will tell you, as a physician, I was an obstetric anesthesiologist practicing in East Baltimore. East Baltimore is a economically underprivileged area, high minority population, where it was painful to watch mother after mother coming in their teens or 20s, addicted to drugs. And when they're addicted to drugs in their 20s, they'd come for childbirth. We'd know that they have a less than optimal life in front of them and in front of that child that they're bearing that day. It was painful to watch. And from that time on, I decided that I was going to help in whatever way I could to make sure that we minimize that impact on society. Now, with legalization becoming more widely accepted in various jurisdictions, I think it is important for us to have a very factual discussion, very factual scientific discussion about the impact marijuana has not only on the human body and the human brain, but on society in general and even our economy. You know, the health impact, you're going to hear a lot about it today, and I'm sure that Dr. Fleming will talk about it. It can obviously have a wide range of proven effects on the brain, body, and behavior, short and long-term effects on brain development, memory and cognition, motivational systems and rewards, which I'll talk briefly about a little later, and obviously addiction, again, which is Dr. Fleming's specialty. There are many studies, and I won't go into them, that delve into these aspects. Brain development, especially among teenagers and young adults with developing brains, where we now know that neuronal pathways are altered by the regular use of marijuana. We have pretty good evidence that the regular use of marijuana actually, probably through mechanisms like that, decreased the IQ and the development of intelligence over time, certainly things that are not optimal for human development. The reason why the whole discussion of legalization is so important, because a lot of people say, well, just legalize it for adults. Well, we legalize cigarettes are only legal for adults. It doesn't stop underage individuals from using them. And that effect on underage individuals is exceedingly important with the increasing scientific evidence that, in fact, it does permanent structural damage. So we can't have a discussion about legalization for adults without a rational, scientifically based discussion, educating America about the effect, the spillover effect that will have on underage individuals, because it will have a spillover effect. And there are numerous studies that show it. Relaxing laws clearly leads to more teenager drug use. When I took statistics, the first thing they said is, when you plan a study, do something that's not intuitively obvious. It should be intuitively obvious to everyone that if you legalize marijuana for adults, more children will use marijuana, because the message that it's dangerous will be blunted. And that's a message that, in fact, we're discovering it's even more dangerous than we thought, not less dangerous than we thought for younger individuals. So clearly more research is needed. There's no question about it. Before we make these policy decisions, we need to do more research. The research has to be on the health impact of recreational marijuana drug use. We don't know what the long-term health impact is for both adults, but especially for youth. It's clear we need to do that. The educational effect, the effect on education is exceedingly important because there's increasing evidence that drug use by youths actually adversely affects their educational outcome. Now, I would hope as a country and as individuals, we actually want the optimal educational outcome for everyone in this country. We spend tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to educate our youth, and yet on the other hand, we're about to embark on a path of legalization that we know will impair the educational outcome of our youth. Finally, we need to understand the economic impact of marijuana. This was made very plain to me when I visited a business in my district that actually is a pharmaceutical drug manufacturer, very worried about Maryland's new decriminalization law, which they thought would adversely affect their workforce. And there's good evidence to believe it would be. We know scientifically that marijuana affects cognition and motivation. Now, in the 21st century global economy, what two things would you like to have your workforce perform at world-class level in? Cognition and motivation. And we know from scientific evidence that these are adversely affected. So that the argument made that if we just legalize marijuana and we obtain revenues and governments will actually, and our economy will actually do better in any way, shape, or form, is not founded in any scientific data. And in fact, I believe when we do these studies, we are going to show adverse economic impacts, global economic impacts on our economy by the use of marijuana in the workforce. And just finally, I do support marijuana research, but on the components of marijuana so that we treat it like all the other drugs we use as a physician, that I use as a physician, where I prescribe a specific chemical at a specific dose in a specific number of times a day, not the way medical marijuana is prescribed. And again, I want to thank Sam and Heritage Foundation for putting on this very important conference. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Heritage for having this, I think, very important discussion, and I really see this as the beginning. We've really been behind the curve, I think, in distributing the information that's so vital on the topic of addiction, especially when it comes to marijuana, now that we have a lot of legislation activity going on across the country. Now, as a physician, I have dealt with addiction from all corners of life: alcohol, marijuana, heroin. I used to provide methadone as a part-time medical director for a drug rehab center, and really have observed a lot, have studied a lot. As you heard, I wrote a book on the subject. And one fundamental fact has really come clear to me, and with each year we find more and more studies that support this. And that is this one very important fact. Today's addict is yesterday's teen who is experimenting with drugs. And we see this over and over again. And why do we know this? Well, you have to understand that science tells us that drugs, whether or not it's alcohol or marijuana, when it goes into the young brain, it begins to reform and refashion, both on a cellular level, a microscopic chemical level, and really thirdly, we find out recently, even on a structural level. Does anyone here know what the average age that a child or teen begins smoking, drinking, and using marijuana? That's right. Oftentimes you see a young adult getting in difficulty with drugs or alcohol, getting into rehab. And the belief is that that person suddenly developed an addiction at age 24 or 25. The truth is that addiction began one day at a time, beginning at age 10. Now, when does the human brain actually mature? We find out it's in the late 20s. So you see, we're exposing, when you have children or teens who are using these addicting substances, they are literally exposing and reformatting the human brain and leading it towards using the reward system within the brain, norepinephrine, serotonin, and all of those basic chemicals in the brain, leading it towards a life of addiction. And this actually shows up in statistics. Among adults who begin using marijuana, there's a 1 in 11 lifetime risk of addiction. In teens, it's 1 in 6. So you see, it's literally twice as frequent younger in life. And so we understand that that process begins very early. But let me share some more statistics with you. Just how frequent and how problematic this is, even though we haven't legalized marijuana through most of the country yet. 16.5% of 8th graders have experimented with marijuana. Almost 40% of 10th graders have experimented with pot. And nearly half of 12th graders have experimented with this highly addictive substance. We also know that 6.5% of 12th graders are daily marijuana users, well on their way to a lifetime of addiction. And of their 12th grade peers, 60% do not think there's any harm in regular marijuana use. And let me stop there for a moment. Most of y'all are familiar with NIDA that does so many studies on this. Government funded, they do a lot of work on this. Nora Valcall, who is an expert, Dr. Valcall. And her studies show that there's no question that marijuana is a gateway drug. In fact, I'll tell you what an addict told me once. He said, "Doctor, every addicting drug is a gateway drug. But what happens is you go for the drug that's the most available and the least threatening. And in this case, it's going to be marijuana. And then after marijuana, as you begin to have that reward system ginned up time and time again, you step over to the next drug and the next drug. And so today's meth addict or heroin addict, more times than not, more often than not, started out as a regular marijuana user. So we have to understand that is in play here. Humans do not just suddenly decide they're going to go out and experiment with meth. If you find somebody who used meth as their first illegal drug, then you take a snapshot of them because that is rare. It doesn't begin that way. It begins with the regular use of much more frequent drugs such as marijuana. The other work that Nora did is very important is that there is a direct correlation with the lowering of threats or risks to using marijuana and use among young people. That is to say that the more accepted it is, the more legal it is, the less likely you're going to get in trouble using it, the more likely you're going to experiment with it. So these are all very important facts. Now, let's talk a little bit about the myths. As you heard Dr. Harris say, we really don't have a described benefit yet for marijuana for medical use. Where did this all begin? Well, somebody reported years ago that cancer patients felt better in some cases when they smoked marijuana. Well, that's no big surprise. We know any drug that makes you feel better should hopefully make someone who's in such pain and distress feel better. So that's no big surprise. The same is true of opioids and other drugs which we control very carefully. But beyond that, somehow this idea that it's now a medicine, that it can treat diseases and disorders, it can cure cancer, in fact, is just complete rubbish. There is no support for that whatsoever. But yet you read about it all the time on the internet. Now, the other is that marijuana is not addictive. Folks, we've clearly defined it as an addictive substance. We all know in our personal lives people who have started using marijuana and can't stop, no matter how hard they try. And there is a withdrawal syndrome associated with it. You know, one of the interesting things is while a practicing physician, we began in the 80s to do drug tests for the factories nearby because more and more they were running into problems with people who do odd things and dangerous things in the factories. And so they began to drug test. And sure enough, in many cases there would be a 50% positive rate of drugs, most marijuana, but cocaine would be the second most. And so once they started that policy, the people using drugs would leave and they'd go to other companies that weren't drug testing. And so then they would come to us and it'd be a 60% rate. And before you know it, the only factories out there that really had drug addicts operating within their employment were ones that weren't drug testing. And so you see that threat, that preemptive approach does a lot to keep people, if they're going to remain in employment, they're going to say, look, I'm going to stay away from that stuff. Marijuana is harmless. Folks, our studies, and you heard Dr. Harris talk about the effects on the brain. There are studies showing that it doubles the frequency of psychotic disorders, that it has more tar than tobacco smoke does. It can lower IQ, and again, we're seeing all kind of problems. We're beginning to see problems with drug driving. And people say, well, it's a lot safer for someone to be smoking pot and driving rather than drinking. Well, I hate to tell you this, but oftentimes people do both. So it becomes an additive feature and something that has been common in the last 10 years, and that is polypharmacy. People don't just choose one drug over another. They add the next one and the next one and the next one as they stair-step up in their addiction. Marijuana today is not the same marijuana that your parents smoked. It's 4 times stronger. It's being purified. It's stronger and stronger, and we're running, again, into more and more problems with psychological and psychiatric problems. Obviously, the stronger it is, the more likely one is to develop addiction. Now, what about young people and what about addiction? The reports and the studies tell us time and time again the most common reason for admission to a drug rehab center for young people today, teens, by far is marijuana addiction. So don't tell me it isn't a problem out there. It really is. And that's expensive. Just one treatment episode in a drug treatment center can cost as much as $30,000. So if you look forward in time and you see addiction rates increasing over time, we can expect there's going to be higher and higher cost into our medical system. Now, my libertarian friends suggest to us the old motorcycle helmet argument, that who am I to tell you that you have to wear a motorcycle helmet when you're riding on your motorcycle? If something happens to me, that's up to me, right? Well, the problem is government and the people and the taxpayers do have a vested interest in what you do on your motorcycle, because we're going to have to take care of you and your family should you have an accident. And the same applies to drugs. We as taxpayers have a vested interest in what society does. And that's been part of the debate with the Affordable Care Act, is what can we do as a society to make sure we're healthier and much less likely to burden the healthcare system. Now, a lot of the original work with our welfare system and our entitlement system has been done right here at Heritage. Robert Rector has done that work. And you know that the largest severe issue on our budget going forward into the future is our entitlement programs, government dependency and the like. And I would submit to you today that if we continue to relax our laws on addiction, particularly with marijuana, relax our laws on the acceptance of marijuana as a drug out there, then we're going to see higher and higher rates of addiction, more and more government dependency, and that's just going to be a greater risk to society and taxpayers going forward. So I would submit to you today that we should not go forward with relaxing our laws on marijuana use. We need to, in fact, I think, put more resources into the prevention of addiction, because we know that addiction is a permanent state. There is no cure for drug addiction. There is treatment, there is recovery, and some people do survive, some people don't. But if we begin to educate our young people, our young families, our parents, going forward, what leads to drug addiction, and that is being the exposure early in life to addicting substances, marijuana being the major one here. If we can reduce that in every way possible, we're much less likely to be burdened as a society with all the morbidity, the mortality, and the cost of marijuana addiction and addiction to other drugs. So I want to thank you all today, and thank you for your time.
Well, especially on this last week of the congressional session, I want to thank both Drs. Harris and Fleming for coming over and starting off with these excellent keynote addresses. And I know you're pressed for time, and as is our tradition here at Heritage, we give male presenters a tie. I picked Navy since we've all been in the Navy together, and wish you season's greetings as well.
Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to take a slight pause, and I'd ask the panelists to come forward and take their seats behind their name cards, and we'll get started in a moment.
I'm Krishna. Nice to meet you.
Is there a clicker or something up here?
Yeah, let me find out. Yeah, there's a clicker here.
It's right there.
Huh?
It's up on there. So
Yeah, I don't know. I think they'll.
yeah, it works. It works.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, just hold on to that. All right, I'm hoping that the AV folks will be able to lower the screen. I get the thumbs up. No? Oh, they're on the side panels. Okay. We've upgraded our auditorium. Well, good morning again, and again, this is the second half of a morning symposium on marijuana policy, separating popular fiction from scientific fact. And now we're going to hear from a distinguished group of experts on that topic. And to get us started off, I want to introduce my friend, Dr. Kevin Sabet, who will then give some opening remarks and introduce the panelists himself. And I want to thank Kevin for co-hosting this with the Heritage Foundation. Quite frankly, Kevin is uniquely qualified to speak about this complicated and quite often misunderstood topic. If you haven't read his book, Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana, you owe me for that plug. You should, because it's well-resourced, it has great footnotes, it takes you to the actual studies that are out there. And I think, frankly, Kevin, as a person who served not only in the Obama administration but other administrations, really takes a sort of common sense, middle-of-the-road approach. He thinks that some of the current laws need to be reformed, others, we can do more things that just makes sense. His background is, quite frankly, impeccable. He's a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, so obviously he knows about marijuana. Obviously from walking around campus only. As a Marshall Scholar, Kevin received both his master's and PhD in social policy from Oxford University. He worked in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy in 3 administrations, President Clinton's, President George H.W. Bush's, and President Obama's. From 2009 to 2011, he served as a senior advisor to the director of the ONDCP, Gil Kurlikowski. Today, Kevin is the director of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida and is an assistant professor in the College of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. He co-founded Project Smart Approaches to Marijuana with former Congressman Patrick J. Kennedy. Kevin?
Well, thank you, Cully, for that very kind introduction. It's exactly how we practice it outside in the lobby, so I appreciate it. I want to thank everyone who's here today and the Heritage Foundation for co-hosting this with Sam and this very distinguished panel that I'm honored to share the table with, including a former boss of mine who I have immense respect for, and people in the audience. We have other former drug czars and directors of NIDA and other institutes here, and really clearly a diversity of opinions in the audience, which is good. One of the things that President Obama told the political appointees when we entered was that we can disagree on policy without being disagreeable, and I think that for the most part, that's been the case even with people who I vehemently disagree with on policy. The reason Sam was even started was actually to lower the temperature a little bit on this issue and actually try and have a rational, sane discussion based on science, understanding that different people will ascribe different values to different scientific fact, but to at least get the information out there to the American people and let them decide based on what's going on. And too often, as I talk about in the book, people base this issue on personal experience, on someone they know, versus on looking at the totality of the scientific fact. And especially with a drug like marijuana, which often the negative effects can take longer to manifest, although not always, than the other drugs, this is even more of a challenge, I think, to have this kind of rational discussion. But we felt it was very important to have the bipartisanship and then to have the scientists, and that's why our founders were one of the most liberal former members of Congress, Patrick Kennedy from Rhode Island, and a person in the Bush administration who frankly wrote the term and came up with the term axis of evil. And the idea that you were going to have the guy that came up with axis of evil standing with the son of the liberal lion of the Senate on any issue, it was pretty far-fetched until we were able to talk about this particular issue and agreeing that we wanted to at least get the science out there. And I'm very happy that the heads of major medical associations and others have joined us in trying to educate folks on the reality of what's out there and on the fact that this is not an issue that fits on a bumper sticker. This is not about legalize or lock them up. This should not be about, sort of marijuana is harmless and cures every disease under the sun, or it's the devil weed that's going to make you use heroin tomorrow. We have to have a more nuanced discussion of this, and my fear is that we are going from, frankly, one extreme to the other very quickly without a considered discussion of the costs and benefits of any policy. And I just to review the last 40 years on drug abuse, we're not anywhere near where we were in the late 1970s with regards to the levels of drug use. But there have been some increases recently that I think are very worrying. First of all, the number of people who are heavy users, meaning they use 21 days or more, has actually increased by a factor of 7 in the last 20 years. And even since our peak of regular drug use in 1979, it is a 50% increase. In other words, we have more heavy users now than we ever have. That, I think, is very concerning. Folks, I am not concerned about the 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old guy who wants to smoke a joint in his basement once in a while. I really could care less, as long as you're not my brain surgeon, my pilot, or driving my kids to school. But I really don't care. What I do care about, though, is essentially manufacturing more heavy users, which is what we have seen in the last 10 years already, and for that manufacturing to come from a corporate industry. Because make no mistake about it, this is not about my old friends at Berkeley, and thank you, Cully, for the plug, around a drum circle wanting to smoke a little weed. That's not why we're having this discussion. They've been doing that for 50 years, okay? God bless them. This is about the mass commercialization of another industry exactly like the tobacco industry, taking pages out of the tobacco industry playbook. And for those that disagree, you should simply look at the financial interests behind legalization right now. The potency has not only grown 4-fold, in many cases 10 to 20-fold average potency. So the kind of marijuana that a lot of my parents' generation smoked in the 60s, or friends at Berkeley smoked even 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago even, is frankly a very, very different drug than now. And that's because we've just become really good genetic engineers. Folks, if you care about Monsanto manufacturing corn, you should really care about the GMO marijuana that's out there now. Because there's no other way to describe the way that the active ingredient has been completely manipulated to increase the high and take away the things that may have medicinal value, things like CBD. I'm very happy to talk about death, so if you give me a minute. It's actually, we also know that marijuana is the second leading cause of impaired driving. It has surpassed tobacco 5 years ago among young people. We've seen that trend there, the green overtaking the red. And the only non-increases in the last two years or so of marijuana use are among very, very young people. The rest are showing increases. When I hear the statistic about death, and I hear people say, well, marijuana's never killed anybody, that makes as much sense as saying that tobacco hasn't killed anybody. And let me explain. Tobacco does not produce a fatal overdose, really. I mean, there's nobody dying. I mean, I think it's possible if you eat a certain amount. I don't think it's happened in the last few years. I mean, it's not a common occurrence, but 480,000 people a year die from tobacco. Nobody would dispute that. They die from the effects of tobacco. They die from mainly lung cancer. The idea that marijuana, something first that you also smoke, the research on lung cancer is mixed, but it's pretty undeniable when you talk about things like COPD. And the idea that a drug like marijuana, which impairs you, unlike tobacco, last I heard there was not a tobacco-related car accident. I mean, unless you were holding one cigarette and maybe driving with the other hand. But in terms of the impairment, there have not been tobacco-related car crashes as there have been with marijuana. And with the high-potent marijuana that we're seeing now, especially with the chocolate bars, the edibles, there certainly have been accidents and things and deaths related to marijuana. So it may not happen directly like it does with alcohol or heroin. Remember, alcohol only directly kills about 1,000 people a year. Folks, 100,000 people a year, though, die from alcohol-related causes. That's mainly violence and accidents as related to alcohol, not from the drug itself. The drug itself is about 1,000 or so in terms of the chronic deaths from alcohol. The other thing that I think that we're seeing the increase that I think is very troubling is this increase in treatment admissions and young people having, and we're going to have many more qualified people talk about that. But the idea that 25 years ago, that marijuana would surpass cocaine and any other drug for treatment admissions in this country, you would have been laughed out of the room. And yes, about half of those come from the criminal justice system, but the other half are not from the criminal justice system. And that increase is not explained from the criminal justice system in the last 20 years. I think that is something we clearly also have to look about. So what do we know? Many of the things were talked about. The potency was already mentioned. There's just a brief graph on the increases in the last 20 years or so, and the fact that the other ingredients have been bred out of today's essentially GMO marijuana. But also we're having these new forms of marijuana. And I hear all this stuff, it's just a plant, right? It's come from God. It comes from the, well, poison ivy and hemlock also come from God, supposedly. Doesn't mean it's safe. Also, what we have been able to do as wonderful farmers and agricultural and horticulturists that we are now is turn marijuana into a form that is beyond the wildest dreams I think that Cheech and Chong ever had when they were rolling the biggest blunt they could roll. And that's when it comes to these things like dabbing these 90-some% concentrates that we're seeing. That is a totally different level than the sort of giggle marijuana from 40 years ago. And we're seeing the negative outcomes. And again, when we talk about, as Dr. Fleming did, the negative outcomes, I don't think anyone is saying that every single person who smokes marijuana, or even every single chronic user of marijuana, is going to have these negative outcomes necessarily. We're saying it's a game of Russian roulette. You're increasing your chance. Yes, you can be Steve Jobs if you smoke a lot of weed and take a lot of LSD. He did. That must mean someone else can too. Yes, you can be a president of the United States, as our last three have after admitting drug use. Yes, it's possible. But the issue is not everybody has the IQ of Steve Jobs. And I hate to break it to some of the new parents in here. Right? Not everyone's 150, where you can afford to lose the 8 points. Not everybody has the other kinds of social supports around them that help them get through those hard times. So the point is, you're just taking a risk. And at least what we want to talk about is that risk is heightened, especially with today's marijuana. But the problem is, I don't know about you guys, but I don't think kids look for their information about marijuana from Medline. or from the journal. Anyone even here, and Stu, you can't raise your hand because you're like a chairman of the committee, but anybody here hanging around the annual conference of the American Medical Association lately? And this is a very austere group here who's, come to hear about marijuana at 11 o'clock on a busy week. None of you? How about footnote 17A in Times 6 font, page 1035 of the Annals of the American Medical Association? Stu, you can't raise your hand. Anyone? No. So if this group is not reading that, if this group Googles for information, as we all do, you can imagine that most of America does the same. And right now, what's on there, frankly, is not representative of the science that's out there. It's why you essentially have most major medical associations saying, wait a minute, let's see what's going to happen before we expand this legalization. Let's research more. The research doesn't look good right now. We're worried about young people using. And then on the other side, you have an industry that's essentially saying, if this is more or less the best thing since sliced bread, and we're going to produce it in many different forms, and oh, by the way, that cherry-flavored gummy bear is really meant for the 45-year-old casual user, folks, not really for young people. Take our word for it. And that's really, unfortunately, the position we have today. I think we're going to have, again, other people talk about mental illness, but we're in the midst of a mental health epidemic in this country. I mean, it took 50 years, and you're going to be so proud of your elected officials when I tell you what they did after 50 years, because you're going to think how progressive it is. 50 years to realize and agree that the brain is part of the body. I know, very controversial, right? And that was after horribly treating, as we still do really, the mentally ill. The idea that in the midst of a mental health epidemic, we would want to increase any kind of risk by expanding use, I can't imagine. And again, other people are going to speak from personal experiences and from the data on that, but I can't understand how if you care about mental health, you can give marijuana a free pass, at least the expansion that we've seen. So unfortunately, what we know versus what matters is very, very different. Because this doesn't really matter unless you happen to attend today, or you're watching online, or you're reading page 1035 or whatever. They're oftentimes very different. I think the gulf has never been greater between the scientific understanding of marijuana and the public's misunderstanding. And that's mainly been pushed, I think, by a commercial lobby whose interest it is to increase heavy use and addiction. Folks, if you're in an addictive industry, you're in the tobacco industry, you're not in this business to cater to the occasional smoker, the one who smokes once a year, on their birthday. If you're in the gambling business, you're not giving this VIP suite upgrade to the guy that comes in once a year. Okay? You are encouraging heavy use. You have to, because that's what increases profit. So for all the folks that have been doing this for 40 or 50 years that frankly just want to be a 60-year-old guy smoking a joint in his basement without being harassed, I could care less. But that movement has been totally hijacked. And it's been hijacked by the corporate interests who realize that this is the next gold rush for them. Now, support for legalization has certainly increased in the last 10 or 15 years. What's interesting is that Gallup, we don't know if it's a one-time thing or not, showed an entire 7-point drop in support. So it's not the slam dunk that advocates are trying to make us believe that this whole thing is inevitable. In fact, the Third Way Institute came out with their poll yesterday, and they showed 50% support. If you saw that, there was a lot of coverage, versus 47% support. So we don't know what's going to happen. We think it's still time to try and have a considered, rational conversation. And we do want to care for those who are sick and dying and those who might benefit from the medical components. I happen to believe, and there may be some disagreement among the speakers, that there is actually a lot of medical promise with the components of the marijuana plant, just like there were for opium and for the willow tree. But we don't ask you if you've used aspirin to chew willow bark, nor do we ask you to smoke opium to get the effect of morphine. We should simply harness the components of marijuana, get rid of the hurdles that are out there for the research, and we can talk about that if we need to. And actually, I would even go one step further for those that truly have a need. The person that looks like this, folks, not this guy from California, the 32-year-old, white male with a history of drug abuse and some self-reported lower back pain. But for the person that really needs it, get them in an experimental program, whatever elements of marijuana might be helpful to them, and let's study it. We should do that. And I've been critical of my former colleagues about the speed of which that research is done. They're sick of me talking about it, actually. And that's fine, but that is a very different conversation than this. This conversation is frankly about the corporate barons who are here with their private equity industries, their fundraising, that look, frankly, a lot more like me. In fact, a lot of people think on the right does. I'm sort of offended by that. But anyway, that look a lot more like me than they do Cheech and Chong and the old hippies and the parody. This is what keeps me up at night, folks, not the old hippie that wants to smoke a joint. And I think we need to wake up to the fact that we were lied to for a century by an industry like this that essentially funded their own science, obscured any research that an independent authority presented, and told the American people and got away with it for 100 years that, we're not really sure about the connection with cancer and science. We don't know if it's addictive. Folks, executives up until 1998 said that the connection between tobacco and cancer was unclear. I don't know why we would want to repeat that nightmare. And I'm not saying we need to have a overly control enforcement oriented kind of thing where you have mandatory minimums, draconian policy, mass arrests, criminal records. Get rid of all those things. But the alternative to that doesn't have to be this. It doesn't have to be the vaporizers brought to you by Groupon in every single color that looks like a highlighter and sponsored by entertainment stars. It doesn't need to look like this, harnessing a brand like Bob Marley that young people know about. To folk, by the way, I think it's very ironic that the poster child of rebellion is now the corporate shill. I think that's very ironic because those guys I showed you just paid a pretty penny for this. And it doesn't have to be this. The ice creams, cookies, candy bars, sodas, spreadables, free $1 joint if you show your ski pass in Colorado. If you want to get rid of some of the injustices of the past, or if you want to harness the medical potential. So that's really what we're about. And I do want to thank you all for coming. I want to introduce the panel, who I'm very excited that they're here. And I'd first like to introduce Dr. Stu Gitlow, who's the president of the American Society of Addiction Medicine. He also chairs the Health Subcommittee of the American Medical Association. He is also on the board of SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, to come and talk about some of these issues as well, and then we'll introduce the rest of the panel. Yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Stu.
Well, good morning, folks. We're here because of a statistic. And the statistic is a straightforward one that I don't think people readily think about, which is that the bulk of people using psychoactive drugs, addictive drugs, don't typically end up with any difficult circumstances as a result of their use. We can look at the average person who has smoked a pack a day for 10 years and ask that person, what's wrong with you as a result of your smoking a pack a day for 10 years? And they'll say, well, I have a little cough in the morning, and that usually will be the extent of it, if they even have that. Or the average person who after work stops at the bar and has 2 or 3 cans of beer, maybe 3 or 4 cans of beer. Maybe he's drinking more than the average amount, but as long as he waits there long enough to go home in his car when he's already under the legal limit and doesn't get into any trouble because of that, again, your average individual who drinks a little bit more than in moderation, that individual is not going to have any negative consequences as a result of his use. So when we talk to people who use marijuana, the average person who used marijuana over an extended period of time does not notice that he or she suffers any negative consequences. And so when we have the nation coming together to have a discussion about what to do about this or that drug, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or marijuana, we all come to the table with our individual experiences. And if we've never used, then our experience is we have no idea. And if we use to a reasonable extent or even an unreasonable extent, the majority of us are going to say it had no negative consequences because that's the statistic. That's what we're faced with, is that most people won't have problems. So the argument then becomes, well, if most people don't have difficulties, shouldn't we simply let everybody use it as much as they like? The problem there is twofold. The first is that there are going to be 10 to 15% of people who get into trouble with the drug, just like they do with alcohol. It's not the majority by any means. In fact, it's a fairly small minority. But we have to recognize that despite the fact that a minority of people have difficulties related to the drug, if you put tobacco and alcohol together, they are the two leading causes of sickness and death in our country. Everything that we've just gone through in this country with respect to saving healthcare costs could have been readily accomplished by simply saying we're not going to have alcohol and tobacco anymore. We would have saved more money if we had gone that route. But that route would never be accepted by a population, 90% of whom don't have problems with these drugs. So when we're looking at the marijuana question, if you will, what we're faced with is the same question we have and haven't really answered with respect to tobacco and alcohol, which is, are we interested in letting 10% of the population fail as a result of having this drug available, despite the fact that 90% of the population will not fail when they are confronted with this drug over and over again? Is that the trade-off we're willing to make? Is that the gamble we're willing to make? And that's the question that each individual also asks right before they pick up the drug for the first time to try it. They can say to themselves, I have a 10% chance of my life going down the tubes as a result of my using this drug. But I have a 9 in 10 shot of that not happening. That's the question they ask. And so people end up picking up the drug, and 9 out of 10 of them end up okay. But the other one doesn't. The other one ends up with addictive disease, loss of IQ, possible psychiatric ramifications, and an enormous cost to society. That's the statistic that we are faced with when we ask ourselves the question, do we want to go down the same path we've gone down with alcohol, the same path we've gone down with tobacco, again? And of course, there's that icing on the cake with marijuana that makes everybody think we're asking a different question this time. And the icing on the cake has been essentially what I've called the camel's nose under the tent, which is this entire false accusation of a perfectly reasonable plant as being medically valuable. There are medical values to tobacco too, but we don't tell everybody to start smoking because we can take the components of tobacco that are potentially useful and synthesize them out into medicines. We can do that, as Kevin said, with willow bark as well. And I'm sure we can do it with marijuana. The testing has to be done, the studies have to be done, and I think it would be difficult to find a physician or a medical organization today who's opposed to doing the proper research the way we have for plants for hundreds of years, the way we have for medicines for the past 100 years. We go through the normal process, the normal routine in order to figure out whether or not there's a component that works, and then utilize that component as we have multiple other medicines over the years. But to say right now that the plant marijuana, which has hundreds of components to it, has a medical value is putting the cart way before the horse. We're not there yet. There is no legitimate research that at this time demonstrates that the plant marijuana has medicinal value. Now, I'm the first person to believe that marijuana contains components that would be useful for various medicinal purposes. Let's find them. Let's find them, synthesize them out, and make them available without the risky component of marijuana, without the dangerous addictive component of marijuana, but something that is simply useful as a medicine. That would be the next step to take. But that nose under the camel's tent, that method of training the American public to believe that a drug is not only safe but is beneficial, is what essentially has turned the tide toward legalization. And that's something where the American Society of Addiction Medicine stands up, along with the AMA and the APA, saying this is bad news, because what this will do is imply to our youth that the drug is safe. That will result in more people using it than would otherwise have used it, and more people will end up with the negative consequences than would otherwise have ended up with the negative consequences. And that's the huge downside right? That's the part no one is really willing to talk about, is that the negative consequences will start to rise in terms of their total volume, even though the percentages haven't changed. One last thing. It takes 3 things to make a person an addict, 3 building blocks, if you will. The first is that there needs to be some genetic predisposition. The second is that there needs to be an environmental trigger. The third, which is an absolute necessity, is you have to live in a society that promotes the use of drugs, a society that has things like happy hour, a society that says these drugs with negative consequences might be good as medication, a society that says on the day you turn 21 you should get drunk as anything, right? Unless you live in a society like that, you don't have addiction. Because without the drugs being regularly available and regularly promoted, people wouldn't try them and wouldn't use them, and they might have the genetic abnormality, and they might have the environmental insult, and they might go through their life being a little less comfortable than everybody else, but that's as bad as the disease would get. Were it not for our being a culture that promotes the use of drugs. So let's not go down that path any more than we already have, and let's back off a little bit on the direction that we seem to be going. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gitlow. I'm not sure, do we have Dr. Gray's slides up on the panel? I'm not sure if there's someone that could check on that. Maybe, okay, yeah, we switch. You know, I think that was great. I think when you talk about the 3 building blocks, I think one of the issues is, of course, that really this is what I think you would call a pediatric onset kind of disease. This is something that really most likely starts when you're young. In other words, I don't know how many people know a drug addict, with the exception of, with the pill epidemic where we had overprescribing, but with the other mainly illegal drugs where that use started after age 21. So if 99% of the problem starts when that person is younger, then that, to me, again, that's where we get Joe Camel. I mean, the idea that Joe Camel, a cartoon, was supposed to be, which is what the tobacco industry said, was supposed to be really targeted towards the average 61-year-old American man who wanted to smoke, or that candy cigarettes were really just a fun piece of bubble gum. They weren't meant to start people down modeling using cigarettes, I think is pretty ridiculous, and I think that's something that we're seeing today. So I'm going to, let's see if, I think we're going to get his slides up in a minute. Krishna, if you don't mind going next. I'm really honored to invite Dr. Krishna Updaya from Johns Hopkins here, Children's Center, to come and speak, also as a DC resident, about some of the impacts both on the medical and the recreational side that she's seeing when it comes to young people. So Dr. Updaya, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the discussion today. And I think this is a topic that is of great concern to me, both as a pediatrician who focuses my practice on adolescents, but also as a mother who is raising children here in the District of Columbia. I was planning to speak after Dr. Gray, who I think is going to show a lot of great data about what we know about teens and marijuana use. And I want to, so I'm going to let him do that and not go through that after I'm done. But I really want to thank him and the American Society of Addiction Medicine and the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry for really squarely entering this policy debate and highlighting the real risks to mental health associated with marijuana use, particularly among youth. So with that as a background, I'm just going to step back, and my goal is really to give a more generalist perspective on this topic. So how many people in this room have heard of an adolescent medicine doctor before today? Anyone? Okay, a couple. Okay, great. So for those of you who aren't familiar, adolescent medicine docs are pediatricians, internists, or family physicians who voluntarily spend an extra 2 to 3 years training just so they can treat adolescents. And many people give me a funny look when I tell them that that's what I do. But those of us who choose to do it know what a great job it is. And it's very rewarding for us to work with young people as they navigate the tremendous changes that occur during adolescent development, and to help them to stay healthy in order to achieve their goals, whatever those goals are. And it's really through that lens that I view marijuana legalization. So I've been a pediatrician for almost 12 years, and during that time I've counseled many youth about their marijuana use. As the national data reflects, I see youth in my clinic, as Dr. Gitlow said, I see many youth in my clinic who may try marijuana once and have no consequences. But I also see increasing numbers of youth who are using daily and who can't stop. And it may seem obvious to me as a doctor that there's very likely a connection between a teen that's needing to use marijuana several times a day, who's coming to my clinic high, and that teen's inability to succeed in school. But that is not always apparent to the teen that is using. And this is real, these are teens that I see every day that I'm in the clinic. So helping teens to consider the real impacts of their marijuana use has always been challenging. But I think that has definitely become more so in the past few years as the topic of marijuana use for medicinal use and marijuana legalization have become more widely discussed. The first time I remember a patient asking me for marijuana to treat a health condition was about 3 years ago when I was practicing here in DC. And that young man was an athletic, healthy 18-year-old about to go to college. He was a basketball player, and he had experienced several knee injuries and told me that his uncle had suggested that he talked to his doctor about medical marijuana for his knee pain. Since then, however, it has become quite common for teen patients to report that their marijuana use actually helps them to treat a variety of ailments, and that's in spite of no doctor ever recommending it to them for those purposes. So one of the things that we learned very early in the practice of pediatrics and of adolescent medicine is that the factors that are most likely to negatively impact our patients' health are things that are out of our direct control. Things like poverty, neighborhood safety, family stress, or educational opportunity. And I think what Dr. Gray's presentation will highlight is that there are many impacts that we know of marijuana on the teens that use themselves. But I think it's also really important to remember that children and adolescents are also greatly impacted by the substance abuse of their parents and caregivers. And so we can't forget that when we're talking about this policy debate. Because of these contextual effects, it is also emphasized to us as pediatricians that we must advocate on behalf of kids to promote policies that support and sustain healthy environments for youth, and to speak out when policies are likely to promote harm. So from my perspective, we as a society should be really concerned about how marijuana legalization is likely to impact the environments our youth grow up in. We have a responsibility to honestly present and evaluate the evidence, and I don't think that so far we've been doing a very good job of that. So as an example, a few months ago I testified at a hearing regarding the expansion of medical conditions eligible to be treated by marijuana here in the District of Columbia. And that legislation authorized the use of marijuana for, quote, any condition for which treatment with medical marijuana would be beneficial as determined by the patient's physician. It was disturbing to me that in a hearing that lasted more than 3 hours, I was the only person there to challenge the scientific basis of that expansion. On the other hand, the legislators heard from many people who reported their personal experiences with using marijuana to treat health conditions. They heard from people who work in the dispensaries, and they heard from paid advocates from organizations that promote legalization. Many of those witnesses speculated on the reasons why more doctors weren't recommending marijuana to their patients. However, none of the reasons they cited, including concern over lack of efficacy or risk of harm. And those are the concerns that are foremost in my mind as a clinician. So by the time I had my chance to speak, I felt more like an amusing oddity, really, than a witness. And it seemed pretty clear that I was unlikely to have much impact. But I went ahead with my testimony and presented the legislators with copies of Nora Volkow's, at that time recently published New England Journal of Medicine article that outlined the scientific evidence on health effects of marijuana. I spoke about how marijuana differs from medicine, that when I prescribe medicine to patients, which I do every day, I need to be able to discuss with them the expected side effects and the likelihood of experiencing those effects, and that there's no way for me to do that with marijuana. And overall, I emphasize that as a physician, I did not want to be placed in the role of gatekeeper over a non-standardized and non-evidence-based therapy. That role makes no sense, and practicing medicine based on the standards of public opinion is not in the best interest of patients or doctors. So what I took away from that experience was that the interests promoting marijuana legalization are much more organized and have been much more effective at promoting their interests than we doctors have been. By not speaking up we have allowed our credibility with the public to be used in ways that we should be concerned about. Our silence has contributed to the changing perceptions of marijuana as beneficial, and I really do not think that has been in the interest of our youth. So before I end, I do want to make clear that criminal justice disparities and incarceration are also major threats to health and to safe environments for youth, including the youth that I care for in my practice in East Baltimore and the youth that I cared for here when I worked in the District of Columbia. Like most public health problems, however, the solutions are not simple. And yesterday I attended an NIH conference and was fortunate to hear a presentation by Dr. Thomas Leviste, who's the director of the Center for Health Disparities Solutions at Johns Hopkins. In the presentation, Dr. Leviste outlined 4 major disparities affecting our country: wealth disparities, educational attainment disparities, criminal justice disparities, and health disparities. And he really emphasized how these are mutually reinforcing. So last year here in the District of Columbia, over 90% of our white students scored at least proficient on our standardized reading test, while that proportion was less than 40% among black children. Similar disparities exist in other urban communities. As a pediatrician, I urge policymakers and the public to question whether legalizing a substance whose psychoactive effects includes loss of motivation and loss of cognitive function is really an appropriate approach to addressing the complex and interrelated disparities that we face. An honest look at the evidence we have and the history of other legal drugs, as has already been alluded to, suggests to me that it isn't. The evidence suggests that it isn't our most disadvantaged communities that will benefit from legalizing another drug, and that doing so won't improve the conditions in which our children grow up. So I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this event, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I think we all appreciate those remarks and that sort of call to action for physicians. And it sort of brought, for me, to mind 2 issues. One, at the end, the issue about disparities. Folks, it's not a surprise that there are 8 times as many places to buy cigarettes in poor communities of color in this country than in upper-class white communities. It should not be a surprise that there are something like 11 times more outlets for the lottery and gambling in underprivileged communities than there are in communities with higher socioeconomic status. And it's not like those communities with higher socioeconomic status don't like to smoke or drink or gamble. They do. In fact, they oftentimes do it at a higher rate. But if you're in this addictive business, and the point of being in business is to increase profits, and the only way to do that is to increase use, and heavy use especially, you have to go to the most vulnerable parts of society that don't have access to the education, healthcare, housing, other opportunities that may shield them from sliding into greater problems. That doesn't mean that you then go on the opposite side of the pendulum and criminalize all kinds of activity and make sure that you have a criminal record for doing something stupid when you were 16 that prevents you from getting a job when you're 30. No. But unfortunately, that has been this false dichotomy that's been presented on this issue, that there is only 2 ways to deal with it. The other thing that Christian brought up that I'll just briefly comment on is this issue about advocates. And obviously, this is a free and open debate, and we're thankful for that. But I do think it's brilliant that people say, well, what happened in the mid-90s? If marijuana's been around for thousands of years and the claim is that it's had health benefits for thousands of years, what happened in the mid-90s that would make us kind of shift as a country? That third way poll that I told you about earlier that showed 50% support of legalization showed about 78% support for medical marijuana. So how did that shift come about? Well, that shift came about very easily, folks, and it was a brilliant strategy. You essentially turned the face of marijuana in this country from the 35-year-old guy who, lives at home in his mom's basement. That's the stereotype. That was the stereotype. You turned that, whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. It was a general stereotype of the 80s and 90s, a marijuana user. You turn that person into the 85-year-old granny dying of cancer. And you bring the 85-year-old granny down to the steps of the legislature, you're not going to find one legislator to vote against anybody that tells a heart-wrenching story. Now, that doesn't mean that 85-year-old that there aren't medical properties that could help that person. That's not the point here. The point is to describe the political strategy that frankly was brilliant, and I think we need to separate the discussion of finding those medicinal components, the children with seizures that seem, last week there was an epilepsy conference in the DC, many of you have heard, the first time ever research was presented after years of anecdote and sort of this is a miracle drug kind of reporting, showed a modest success with CBD for those kids with epilepsy. And if I was a parent whose kid was helped by that, I wouldn't say modest, I would say it was a wonderful thing that should be spread. And that's fine. But that should be very much separated from this discussion of legalization or this discussion of, well, this CBD oil works, so therefore all marijuana is good. Or this CBD oil works, so, you know, instead of going to a pharmacy and getting it from a pharmacist and a doctor, it's much better if a 29-year-old with no medical experience sells it down at the strip mall. We should be adults, have an adult conversation about the medical components and treat them as such, as opposed to sort of give into this political campaign. And so I want to introduce Dr. Kevin Gray from the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Again, just like Dr. Upadhyaya, at the front lines of dealing with this issue, and you know, they did, as an association, recently come up with a position that I think he's going to expound upon a little bit. So, Dr. Gray, thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be with this distinguished group, and I'm really glad to get to speak to the audience about an issue that's really important to me as a physician scientist, but also to the organization I represent, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and we're really out to advocate for the health of adolescents. And so this has been a hot-button issue for us, and we've tried to be as front and center about it as we can, because we know we're one of many voices, and we have what may be argued as a skewed perspective. We represent adolescent health, and even more specifically, the vulnerabilities of adolescents with mental health problems. You know, that certainly is something that's been tucked away in the corner largely, something we want to bring front and center, and I think it really has resonance with this issue with marijuana use. So in one way, I'm presenting as a physician scientist who has dedicated his career to developing treatments for young people with addictions, but also as a representative of an organization who wants to advocate for sensible policy regarding marijuana. So as a scientist, I always give my disclosure slide. I think it's in everyone's best interest for us to see where money comes from and where it flows. I'm employed by the Medical University of South Carolina. My research is primarily funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has been wonderful to me in funding what I think is important research. I've done some unrelated research that's been funded by a couple of pharmaceutical companies, not related to substance use, and my travel here today was supported by ACAP. So marijuana in adolescents. No surprise to this group, and I think I'm reinforcing some stuff that's been discussed, is marijuana initiation typically occurs in adolescence. The most recent data from the Monitoring the Future survey indicates that about half of high school seniors by that point have tried marijuana. About a quarter are current users. That means within the past 30 days that they've used marijuana. And I think here's the subpopulation I'm most interested in as a clinician, is the 1 in 15 who use daily. So that's about 6.5%. These are the adolescents that come to me in practice and who also sign up for my marijuana cessation research studies. And this has been a very difficult group to treat, which is why NIDA has been interested in funding the research we do. There's no question, and I think even amongst those who are very positive about advocating for marijuana legalization, is that marijuana is an addictive substance. And as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I'm most concerned about the disproportionate propensity for addiction with adolescents as compared to adults. And you've heard the statistic earlier, and it holds true, is 1 in 11 adults who try marijuana become addicted, yet 1 in 6 adolescents who try marijuana become addicted. So there is something specific to adolescents at this primary age of initial onset and progression and use happens to be the most addictive potential age group. And so in a dose-dependent manner, meaning with chronicity and frequency of use, adolescent marijuana use is associated with several well-known adverse academic, cognitive, behavioral, psychiatric, and substance use outcomes. This is why this issue is so important to ACAP. This is near and dear to what we do. And it's very clear that the marijuana-associated risks are actually very well described. And we heard earlier reference to Nora Volkov's review article in New England Journal of Medicine, which summarizes these very clearly. I think the other point of emphasis is that the large majority of people who have tried marijuana have occasional benign experiences, yet I do have the skewed perspective of seeing those who have serious chronic problems with it, and that's where my concern comes paramount. So adolescent brain development is something we really have to touch on when we discuss adolescence and any substance use. And it confounds us. So those of us who are parents, myself as a clinician who focuses with adolescents, we get driven crazy by the behavior of adolescents. And we know it's not a linear development from childhood behaviors to adult behaviors. We know this is storm and stress. Strange things happen in adolescence, and we're increasingly understanding what's happening during this time. So to oversimplify it, so I've got a figure from B.J. Casey's publication a few years back in the Orange Journal, as we call it, the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, where you see that the prefrontal cortex, as we call it the wizard brain, it's sort of what makes us human, it's reasoning, long-term planning, is developing in adolescence in a linear fashion. However, the striatum, which we call the lizard brain, which is really more interested in getting what I want right now, is developing in a curvilinear fashion. And so during this time, adolescents, by way of brain development, are prone to taking risks. They're valuing immediate reward over considering long-term consequences. This helps us to understand why adolescents may be more vulnerable to A, begin using, and B, to become addicted. They are prone to repeating use of something that feels good right then, never mind the consequences. And ironically, of course, is structures and transition are also the most vulnerable to lasting adverse outcomes. And so adolescents have the perfect storm of being more likely to use and more likely to suffer adverse consequences. Now, on the other hand, you've heard a little bit about cannabinoid therapeutics, and I'll have to say also, I'm a member of the International Cannabinoid Research Society. I'm very excited about potential cannabinoid therapeutics, but I want to reinforce what other speakers have told you is there's a wealth of information that suggests that manipulation of the endocannabinoid system may have therapeutic value. However, the large majority of data on that, if we talk about cannabinoid therapeutics, has been a number of cannabinoid analogs, but actually more specifically isolated compounds that are administered orally, not smoked marijuana, which is, as some would say, is sort of a dirty drug. We don't have control on dosing. We have a number of other chemicals, constituents, and it's not a safe way to administer a medication. So there is potential promise, and there actually are 2 oral THC compounds that are readily available, FDA approved, and yet smoked marijuana has no approved uses. So the idea that getting THC to people is not available medically is false. So it's readily available and prescribable. Now, part of the problem with messaging is adolescent perceptions, and this is something that's been touched on a little bit here. So, as a physician, every day I go through risk-benefit analysis with patients and families, and I have to really manage the idea if I'm prescribing a medication, what are the potential benefits, what are the potential risks? But this can get really, really convoluted when you have constant barrage of messaging to adolescents about something not only being benign, but being good for you. And so you hear this misleading term of medical marijuana, and you have aggressive marketing. So you get people thinking, well, if it's medical, it must be beneficial. And of course, it's not new that when people say something is natural, therefore it's harmless. So perception is critically important. And here's a couple things I share with adolescents and families. Here's a couple things that are natural, yet you don't want to encounter them. Toadstools, poison dart frogs, poison ivy, rattlesnakes. And I think even a more nuanced argument in this is the idea about something being medicine. So these 2 pictures of the same product, warfarin or Coumadin is a life-saving blood thinner for people with certain conditions. That said, Coumadin or warfarin is rat poison. It's the very same thing. And so for a specific population, something can actually be life-saving, and for others be poison. And I think that's something to really highlight the idea about really kind of going against some misinformation, being very clear about even when something is declared legitimately a medicine, it could be a very risky proposition for certain vulnerable people. The reason adolescent perception is so important is if I were to try to invent a more perfectly inverse relationship, I could not do so. So this is also from the Monitoring the Future survey, which is NIDA supported, a nationally representative sample of adolescents. We're looking at an inverse relationship between adolescent perception of harm with marijuana use and rates of adolescent use. It's no surprise that in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a significant drop in adolescent perceived risk of using marijuana and also a corresponding increase in rates of use. This also holds on when you look at daily users of marijuana in adolescents. This is high school seniors. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a little bit of good news here, and this is the work I do as a physician scientist, is developing treatments for the adolescents who are unlucky enough to have what we call marijuana use disorder or cannabis use disorder. We used to call it cannabis dependence, but it's a different term now. So there are some evidence-based strategies. It's very exciting. So we use this in practice all the time. Motivational enhancement therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, which thankfully actually works across a number of conditions we treat. There are several modalities of family treatment which can be effective, and there's also a relatively new on the block behavioral strategy called contingency management, which rewards drug abstinence, which has some promise and use in this population. However, the bad news is even with the best of treatments, long-term abstinence outcomes are very poor. So for anybody who tells me that this is not an addictive substance, somebody can stop at any time, they need to see the kids I'm seeing, because it is remarkably difficult for even an adolescent who comes in wanting to stop because they've had severe consequences. It's very difficult to stop using. And this is played out in my team's research. So I'm very proud of this study. It's probably the biggest accomplishment of my career, is we translated some basic science into a real clinical finding of using an over-the-counter supplement called N-acetylcysteine, or NAC. And we more than doubled the odds of abstinence in adolescents who were engaged in a behavioral treatment with us with NAC versus placebo. However, the depressing news is less than half of the adolescents, even the active treatment group who had the benefit, attained clean urines during treatment, and which means that even with the best of cutting-edge treatment development, most kids are still using who actually volunteer to engage in a treatment, telling me that we are really having a hard time treating adolescent marijuana use amongst those who are addicted. Now, with all this stuff in context, I also work as the co-chair of the Substance Abuse and Addiction Committee with ACAP, and we've really tried to be front and center on this issue from a policy information standpoint. So first, we want to educate our patients and families, and so we publish what's called a Facts for Families, and in lay terms talking about potential risks regarding marijuana use. And then we came out with a couple of policy statements in the last couple of years, first on medical marijuana, then we realized we actually had to get one on legalization of marijuana. And so I don't want to bore you with the rote reading of the entire policy, but I think the summary paragraph kind of tells our stance. So, as child and adolescent mental health advocates, ACAP, A, opposes efforts to legalize marijuana, B, supports initiatives to increase awareness of marijuana's harmful effects on adolescents, C, supports improved access to evidence-based treatment rather than emphasis on criminal charges for adolescents with cannabis use disorder, and D, supports careful monitoring of the effects of marijuana-related policy changes on child and adolescent mental health. And again, this is really trying to take the balance of information we have regarding risk and benefit and really get at the idea there are many different voices in the room, but we have a particular one and we're advocating for a particular population. Similarly, we also had a response to the semi-recent New York Times series of editorials regarding legalization of marijuana, which in short, they're for it. We had a response which New York Times declined to publish, but we published on our website. And we actually partnered with the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it's remarkable, getting a policy statement through a scientific or medical organization is actually a pretty hard thing to do. And both with our policy statement, but also in this response, it actually went through quite rapidly. There was actually something that was a pleasant surprise to me, is that we had a lot of people feeling the same way. So our summary paragraph, I'll let you read it so you don't have to watch me use my failing vision to read the whole thing as well. But along the same lines is, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, both as a physician who treats patients, but also as a scientist who is desperately trying to develop new and more efficacious treatments, but also as physician scientists trying to inform policy, my perspective as a child and adolescent psychiatrist is that we're very concerned about medicalization and legalization, and I think we really have to think long and hard about potential consequences for our most vulnerable populations, including adolescents who suffer with psychiatric conditions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm not sure how many of I learned that how many of you learned just now that ACAP and AAP had a response to the New York Times. Again, a couple of, okay, about 4 of you out of the group here that's, again, come to the district to listen to marijuana. And again, that is exactly illustrates the problem with a lot of the coverage on this. And I want to thank ACAP and AAP and others for being courageous to come out like that. And I'll probably not get anything published in the Times ever after I say this, but they did not meet with any of the major medical associations, most of whom knocked on their doors, refused to meet with Congressman Kennedy, myself, and others when formulating the editorial, refused to meet with the coalitions around mental health and mental illness in this country. So, you know, that obviously got a lot of press and a lot of play, that editorial, and many people who follow this issue know that like the back of their hand, the fact that they had an editorial, but probably don't know that there was the response. And this is, again, all part of the problem with the coverage and the discussion on this that has been clearly really commercial focused and one-sided. I heard the Denver Post is doing very good these days from the ad revenue. From the new, in fact, they have a whole section now devoted to this, and they had Thanksgiving, I think, for Thanksgiving, where they had all kinds of recipes and things that they were promoting. So that's unfortunately what we are facing, but having that scientific perspective is so crucial. And next, I want to go from the 30,000-foot crucial level of the science down to the one-person level, because these stories of the harmfulness and the problems that are going on never get discussed, let alone reported. And so I do want to invite Lori Robinson to come up and share her story. Lori reached out to us and other organizations in the last year after suffering a very terrible tragedy related to this supposedly harmless herb. So, Lori.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm not a public speaker, so hopefully you can bear with me. A quote by Leslie Walker, pediatrician, it haunts me. It takes years to raise a teen to his or her potential, but it takes much less time for marijuana to destroy it. My son started using not until age 19, and by age 25, he was deceased from the consequences of unknowingly, naively playing Russian roulette with today's super potent strains of pot and losing. California voted to legalize medical marijuana when he was age 10. And even though he grew up in the household with my husband and myself, we never used illicit drugs in our life, he grew up in an environment that really legitimized it. So wherever I go, the common sentiment among the youth culture today is it's just pot, and they don't even associate cannabis as a drug. How many Americans realize that 15%, and I know the studies, 15% of pot users are adversely affected by the insidious mental health alterations to their young, vulnerable brains, specifically psychosis and schizophrenia. And let's not forget the others that develop panic attacks, severe anxiety, depression, and in my son's case, and I believe many others, suicide. And we've already heard about the 1 in 6 adolescents that develop addiction. A picture is worth 1,000 words. You don't know who I am. You could think I'm making this up. But I'm asking Christine to pass around a pictorial, a Christmas pictorial, not of 2014, but of 2009. And I brought that from California to show what we sent to our family and friends in 2009 to hopefully give you a snapshot of what I think was my family, a very normal American traditional family. My youngest son graduated from a prep school in Ojai and was on his way to college, and our oldest son was already in his trade. He was very successful as a certified residential electrician. He was actually very prideful that he had a job that couldn't be outsourced. He was actually making really quite good money, and he aspired to own his own company one day. So what's missing from this pictorial? At the bottom of the pictorial, you'll see a beautiful wedding that occurred, his wedding, in August of 2009 to his longtime girlfriend in a very beautiful college campus setting. It was a really crowning moment as a mom. He, unfortunately, 2 months after his wedding, suffered what's called a psychotic breakdown. On a single night, our firstborn son, with 23 years of proven successes, no sign of mental instability ever, went from his normal, gregarious, outgoing self to someone who sounded like an alien. He had the first of 2 psychotic episodes. His bride actually called 911 on his rapidly bizarre behavior, and when my husband and I found him in the middle of the night, we convinced him to get into our car. He asked us if we saw the bombed-out buildings in the middle of the night and told us that he had to save Obama as he tried to jump out of our moving car on the 101 freeway. Shane admitted to us when we finally got him to a locked unit, "I know you don't think I use drugs, Mom, but I'm using marijuana, but it's harmless. It's an herb." The psychiatric community missed, in my opinion, the opportunity to educate and get him into addiction treatment, and especially failed to connect the THC in his toxicology report to the psychosis he presented with. The experts were too stuck on the bipolar I diagnosis, despite the fact that we have no familial history of manic depression, which is bipolar I, or any severe mental illness. To recount the harrowing 10 days our son spent locked in this unit would be to ask you to walk back in time to the old movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Suffice it to say, our son endured the added trauma from the effects of neuroleptics so powerfully administered that he suffered all the side effects: drooling, lisping, shuffled gait, muscle rigidity, and he remained psychotic. We took our three sons to three other psychiatrists, all in hopes of having a complete analysis, including the fact he tested positive for a mind-altering substance, THC. The mantra was always the same: pot doesn't trigger psychosis, this is mental illness. And this is in Southern California in the Ventura area, which probably really good hospitals. Shane took his neuroleptics dutifully for over 5 months, gaining 55 pounds on his beautiful 6'4" stature, developing stretch marks all over his abdominal cavity from the rapid weight gain. And he always complained that his brain felt like he had brain fog. Is it any wonder that so many stopped these medications? Shane eventually weaned himself off these toxic meds, which I believe inflicted more trauma than support. To deal with someone in psychosis for weeks requires an act of courage, and one must learn how to deal with this horrific condition. I swear if more young people would be educated to know the potential mental health changes to some of their brains from using THC, it would scare many to stop. After 10 weeks, our son actually came back, thankfully, to his full normal self. Eventually, I warned my son and his wife of the marijuana psychosis link found in so many scientific journals. But I failed to recognize that pot was actually a part of their social circles. The fact my son went back to using marijuana after knowing what I believed it did to his brain speaks volumes about the addictiveness of this substance and absolutely the failure of the mental health system to recognize addiction in a young adult. Not one expert explained temporary psychosis or first episode psychosis or how even recreational users now develop addiction. When the second episode of psychosis came on as quickly as the first episode, 18 months later, May of 2011, we arranged this time to get our son drug rehab, but he never got it. Instead, he spent the next 13 days locked in a psych unit, a different psych unit, where he wasn't beaten this time. This time he was drugged with multiple neuroleptics until he was in such a drug stupor and discharged so far worse than how he entered. Once again, his toxicology report was positive for THC. At this point, our young son's life basically crumbled. His wife left him. Many of his longtime friends repelled against him. He lost his job, so he came back to live with us, his parents. The same psychiatrist who treated him in the psych unit followed him outpatient. At the first follow-up session, a week post-discharge, I drove him. He wasn't allowed to drive, obviously. He ordered Shane off all neuroleptics, as he looked so good to him. And sure enough, this time around, without any neuroleptics, Shane emerged out of psychosis almost 10 weeks later, almost to the same time frame as the first episode, but this time without neuroleptics. And the scientific literature that I've read, and I've read a lot, in my opinion, is quite clear. First episode has good outcome as long as the person never touches THC again, and often poor outcome if the person goes back to using. Shane begged us to let him start anew, and with the blessings of 2 psychologists who were helping us, he was allowed to move to our cabin near Yosemite. He joined AA. He had his beloved dog with him, and he had access to our ski boat when he moved up there, which he loved so much. And he was, of course, back in nature. No sign of psychosis at all, yet despite being substance-free, our son tragically took his young life 7 months from the second episode. This time the toxicology report was negative upon his death. The losses in his young life could depress many, but he didn't have a depressive personality, anything but. In my opinion, the changes because of marijuana cessation were magnified at this point. To find your child's body dead by suicide should not happen to any parent, yet across America, it is happening. Our son left us a goodbye note, which is actually a gift because most do not leave suicide notes. There was one line that will haunt me forever and why I wanted to come here today. My choices, he wrote, led me to this point. Yes, suicide is a mental health alteration associated with THC. I don't know how many of you have read the recent Lancet journal, but it highlights that young people who use marijuana are 7 times more likely to attempt suicide. Does anyone know that the UK holds parliamentary hearings on the harms from cannabis? In my opinion, in America, we don't have a good tracking system to collect data on adverse effects from pot's use. I'd like to encourage a task force be started with the states that just voted to legalize recreational marijuana use, as I believe we are truly in uncharted waters. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Lori, very much for sharing that and for having the courage to join us today. That was very, very educational. You know, I think Shane's story is gripping, and one of the things mentioned that Lori mentioned is, you know, he was 10 years old in 1996 when California went down the path that even advocates say has turned into a kind of a sad or bad joke, depending on your perspective, if you've hung around Venice Beach lately or tried to get a medical card, which seems to be the only qualification is that you have a pulse. No, it's fine. And you know, that all developed, again, as we had talked about earlier, in the mid-'90s with this whole issue of medical marijuana down this path of normalization. And at that time, General Barry McCaffrey, at that time the youngest living 4-star general, was tapped by President Clinton to be his second drug policy director. And you know, talked about what was interesting is that here you had a 4-star general coming in as director, and everyone thought then would only really be focusing on the supply side of the equation. And in reality, under his watch, the most number of drug courts drug courts really started and expanded, as well as one of the biggest increases in addiction treatment and prevention that Congress had ever witnessed, really pushed by him and his office. And many people from that office are here today, and I thank them also for their service. Around that time, I was lucky to sort of see him on his way out for the last 4 or 5 months and work with him. And every single time that he was going to visit, let's say Southcom, or going to Columbia, or going to other places around the country on more of the supply side, he did insist on wanting to speak to everyone in the community who was dealing with treatment. Everyone in the community dealing with prevention, and insisted on going to the front lines, to the ERs, to talk to the doctors that were seeing people, as was said earlier, I think so well, come in for poly drug abuse. Now, this isn't usually one substance when there are problems or multiple things going on. And I had a lot of respect for him for doing that. And also, he was criticized at that time for talking about medical marijuana as a stalking horse for legalization, because folks were saying, no, this really is only for the dying person with cancer, AIDS, or you know, MS. That's it. And he wisely read between the lines, and of course, you know, again, even advocates admit kind of what was going on back then with this movement. So I think he has a lot to teach us and a vast experience. I'm honored to know him and call him a friend. General Barry McCaffrey.
Well, Kevin, thanks very much for the introduction and really for your own work. I think the most important thing I got out of this conference was reading in advance of the session your fact sheets. You know, at the end of the day, I tell people the thing I most prize in policy discussions is objectivity. You got to have facts. Then you go on to debate facts. You can come to competing conclusions, hypotheses. You got to have some data points. And I think this is a tremendous contribution you and Patrick Kennedy and Sam and your board made to the discussion. A discussion has been absent, in my view, of well-informed background. I want to thank the other board members. Stuart Gillow is very important to us. You know, at the end of the day, I hung around ASAM a lot. Yeah. You asked if anybody in the room, and they were a tremendous source of really education to me over the years, along with the other medical community. You know, at the end of the day, this is not a law enforcement issue. It's an issue for medicine, science, public policy, educators, coaches. You know, at the end of the day, if you want to understand this issue, by the way, though, if you want to really understand the day-to-day impact of drug abuse in American society, to include marijuana, you go ask a cop with 10 years on the force, a judge, a social worker, or an emergency room doc. That's where you understand the real impact of addiction. Lori, let me thank you for being here. It's important to us to remember that, you know, this isn't a public policy issue. It's an issue of human beings, one at a time. You know, one of the things I learned early on in this whole effort is the only one that never leaves you is your mother. That's the last face you see going into a treatment community. Your employer drops you, your spouse leaves you, your friends can't take it anymore. They wonder where they failed, but your mother's still there. So thanks for your speaking out, really, and giving us a data point that's really important. A ton of people in the room ought to recognize Ron Brooks, I've worked with over the years, a sensible, informed law enforcement professional. Judge Bob Rencourt, National Association of Drug Court Professionals. This is probably the single most effective thing we've done that I've seen. Except for AA and NA, the biggest deal I run into is the drug court system. We started, I think, with a dozen when I was in public office. We got it to 1,000. They're now at 3,000. We now have 150 some odd veterans treatment courts. So Bob and others, I thank you for your leadership. Bob DuPont in the front row. Was your daughter?
Yes, it is.
I always envied you. On the back of your books, you had a picture of your wife and what both daughters work with you in your clinic. Bob's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, a lot of experience in this field. His publisher once accused me of being the principal seller of his book, The Selfish Brain. I used to almost automatically, because to be honest, it was such a good primer for people like me. I gave it to employees and my own adult children to better understand how to deal with this issue. So thanks for being part of my education over the years. Bob Wiener's here. An active Democrat, been very intense on problems of the aging and drug and alcohol abuse and other issues. So Bob, thanks for you speaking up over the years. Bill Dewey, where are you? You know, a bunch of us came together to form Friends of NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse. We've got this genius scientist, Dr. Nora Volkow, I've known for years. She speaks too slowly, though. Have you ever noticed that? Really a very deliberative manner of talking, but they've done such good for the issue, and Bill and others, particularly in the academic and scientific community, want to make sure that we supported them in resources. You know, at the end of the day, what fights go on in Washington, D.C. are not about policy. It's nonsense. People fight over money, and if you don't get money in your programs, they don't exist in the long run. So, Bill, I thank you for not just for your scientific research, for being such a support to NIDA. I was the drug policy director from 96 to 2001. I was not a volunteer. I did not want the job. I was a serving military officer. Poor President Clinton got in trouble. The election was coming. It looked like he was going to lose. One of the issues was drug policy, and they called me in and said, well, you've done a lot of drug interdiction, and you were a captain and major in the armed forces when we went totally on our back following Vietnam. A lot of it was alcohol and drug abuse. So the president said, we want you to take the job. I said no, told him how to organize the effort better, went home, told my dad, he said, shut up and do what the president asked you to do, which is how I ended up as a drug policy director. And it was a tremendous experience for me. I spent much of my effort. The only easy thing about the drug issue is prevention. You've got to have a screw loose if you want your employees, your children, your Army company smoking pot or using or abusing alcohol, the most dangerous drug in America. So the prevention education mission was, I thought, paramount. And by the way, if you really want to affect drug abuse in America, you start in the 6th to the 7th, 8th grades, you continue it through age 19. Basically, if kids exit that adolescent experience where they have delayed or reduced exposure to drug-taking behavior, they don't finish their last year of law school and start methamphetamines. That isn't the way it works. So you really ought to put most of your effort in a culture into trying to raise children in a healthy environment. CASA does all these sophisticated studies, and one of them used to amuse me. It was risk analysis. I think there were 73 protective and risk factors on drug and alcohol abuse among adolescents. And at the end of the day, by the way, the risk factors were, somebody mentioned parental behavior. If both your parents are drunks or drug addicts, the chances are around 50% that you'll have a substance abuse problem also. If one of them is, it's around a 25% chance. So I just tell people, as parents, as Army First Sergeants, as a coach, you have a real responsibility to act as a role model. Now, the protective factors, and you start listing the ones that under causal statistical relationship show up as reducing drug abuse among adolescents. Number one is, normally everyone gets this right, my parents. What did they say to me? Do I remember, by the way, hearing them with an anti-drug use message? And drug means, among adolescents, ecstasy, pot, and beer. That's the deal. Those are the most dangerous drugs in America, being consumed on a regular basis by a 9th grader. The other protective factors, when I'm playing organized sports, do I eat supper with my parents at night? Do I go to church or synagogue or mosque regularly with my adult parents or not? So you got to focus on prevention. I've spent most of my time, by the way, since I left public office on drug and alcohol rehabilitation. It's such a difficult area, it's unbelievable. Who knows? Pick a study you believe. I say there's probably, I think Bob always tells me, 16 million of us, and when you look at the raw numbers, 307 million of us in the country, maybe 16 million of us have a substance abuse chronic problem of varying degrees. And by the way, I'm glad you underscored the fact that, we've got people called heroin chippers that use heroin routinely and don't encounter legal, social, medical, or family-related problems. But that, in combat, we look at a death rate, killed in action rate, much over 5% on a monthly basis as heavy losses. So I think at the end of the day, what you look at is how we do a prevention message, but then once people are chronically addicted, it's hard work. It's really hard work. You have to get trained people, decent facilities, you have to pay salaries, you have to have long-term efforts. Some of it's easy. Detoxifying a heroin addict is easy. It's 5 days. The chances of losing the patient are 0. But then comes the problem. What we want to hear is 5-year recovery rates. We want to hear lifelong sobriety. We want to hear you're back with your family and working. You got your kids again. You got glasses. You got bus tokens. Your life is engaged. So that the stigma of drug addiction is just terrible. That's where I spend much of my time, trying to work that issue. Does marijuana have a part of it? Of course it does. You know, probably the best, we released a national drug strategy. We had a rolling sort of public event every year for 5 years, and the best one we ever did was up in a New York City emergency room. We went up there and had all the media come, and I said, I'm going to ask the head resident, an intern, and the head of the emergency medicine department to speak to you. I said, I haven't had a word with them at all. I want them to tell you how they encounter drug use in their daily medical lives. And, you know, the answer had half the media people in tears. It includes clearly a psychiatric component for adolescents, or for that matter, some adults, particularly with edibles. We're seeing some strange things. So drug and alcohol treatment, clearly we are concerned about the growing impact of marijuana use and its impact on the population. Now, personally, and I've had the drug legalizers use this in some of their publications thinking it was a positive statement. If I get on an airplane and have a first-class ticket someplace, and so the guy next to me, college-educated, says, well, my dad has an alcohol problem, and by the way, shouldn't we stop the war on drugs? My normal reaction is, I'm no longer paid to worry about this issue. Knock yourself out, whatever your viewpoints are. I actually think we've got a disaster facing us. For 13 years, we had adolescent drug use go down in America. For 4 years, it's gone up. It is amazing. My board of directors included Vice President Joe Biden. My board of directors included both people in both houses of Congress that funded us for enormously enhanced levels of resources on drug and alcohol treatment. Where did they go? I think the bottom line is, and I know we'll have a chance to discuss this, we've lost the message war on the challenges, the health challenges of some of these drugs. We've lost the political war. It can't be a party position. It can't be the left is for it, the right's against it, and the libertarians, who, by the way, libertarians have a nice coherent argument. You know, if you want to smash yourself with no helmet on a motorcycle and become a drug addict, it's your business. But we can't have this be a political issue in the sense that one party's for it or against it. We've lost the media war. This wonderful CNN reporter, Aaron, what's his name? It's just shocking to me to hear her. It's become a matter of humor. And I tell people, by the way, since I spend a lot of time sitting in, you told me to go sit in on 12-step meetings and to not talk about the drug issue until I've gone to 5 of them or something. I still do that, and there is nothing funny about drug abuse. I can assure you of that. You know, in fact, Patrick Kennedy, one of the first educational seminars I had, he took me to a treatment facility for adolescent girls in Rhode Island right after I was confirmed by the Senate. I sat there in a circle of maybe 10 young girls and their mothers or dads, one dad and the rest of them were mothers, and listen to what life is really like when you're dealing with a chronically addicted girl. And for that matter, sitting in a circle with a bunch of mothers in a Rikers Island visiting area and having them tell me that they were only happy when their husbands were in jail. And I said, God, what is that? Because they're criminal activity and annoying? No, we know they're safe here. We know they're safe here, and they're not in the streets, and they're dealing with chronic addiction. That's a challenge. You know, if you tell me on the plane that you live in a log cabin in Oregon, you got a PhD in philosophy, and you have 10 giant pot plants in your backyard, knock yourself out. I don't care. But in terms of public policy, I think we have embarked on a rolling disaster. There's been tremendous intimidation of the political leadership over this issue. Very cleverly done. There's money there, flexible money. Law enforcement has finally shut up and disappeared from the debate. And by the way, that's probably not a bad thing. And now I think the purpose of this effort, Kevin, and your colleagues, And those of us that are happy to support you ought to be to get the rest of the country to say, like Governor Jerry Brown, do we want a stoned society? No more than we want a drunk society would be my answer. And on that note, I wish you all well.
Well, folks, we had a very narrow purpose for today's symposium, not to talk about all aspects of the legalization debate, focus narrowly on the science. That's it. Because I think that's where we believe we need to start. And so we, in Heritage Tradition, first want to thank our panelists, and please join me in thanking them. And a second heritage tradition is we provide edibles in the form of sandwiches and drinks in the form of soft drinks in the lobby. Enjoy yourselves. Our program's concluded.
Well done.